The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the executive boardroom as the words echoed in my ears like a death sentence. Let's be honest, Rebecca. You've been coasting for years. Anyone could do what you do. You're completely replaceable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The room fell silent except for the awkward shuffling of feet from my colleagues who couldn't meet my eyes, and the smug chuckle from David Harrison, the man who had just delivered the most humiliating moment of my 32-year career at Morrison Associates. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I'm 64 years old. For 3 decades, I had given everything to Morrison Associates, the mid-sized consulting firm where I started as a junior analyst, fresh out of graduate school, and worked my way up to Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations. I had sacrificed weekends, missed family gatherings, postponed vacations, and poured my soul into building something I believed was bigger than myself. I thought I was part of a family, a team, a legacy. But standing there in that boardroom on what was supposed to be the celebration of my distinguished career, surrounded by the broken glass and the even more broken remnants of my professional dignity, I realized that I had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. This is the story of how the worst day of my professional life became the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge I could have ever imagined. It's about trust shattered, loyalty betrayed, and the sweet taste of justice served exactly as cold as it deserved to be. It's about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, experience for obsolescence, and respect for entitlement. Most importantly, it's about discovering that sometimes the most devastating defeats are actually setups for the most spectacular victories. The morning of my retirement party had started like any other Friday at Morrison Associates. I arrived at the office at 7:30, just as I had for the past 32 years, carrying my usual large coffee and scanning the morning reports that would shape the day's priorities. The building was quiet in those early hours, with only the security guard and the cleaning crew finishing their night shift. I loved these peaceful moments before the chaos of the business day began, when I could walk through the halls I had helped build and feel the satisfaction of work well done. My office on the 15th floor overlooked downtown Seattle, and on clear days like this one, I could see Mount Rainier standing majestically in the distance. I had earned this view through decades of 60-hour weeks, successful project completions, and the kind of institutional knowledge that becomes the backbone of any organization. Morrison Associates had grown from a small regional firm to a nationally recognized consulting powerhouse during my tenure. And I knew without false modesty that my contributions had been instrumental in that growth. The retirement party wasn't my idea. In fact, I had specifically requested that my departure be low-key, maybe just a small gathering with my immediate team and a nice dinner somewhere quiet. But David Harrison, who had been appointed CEO 3 years earlier, had insisted on something more elaborate. "Rebecca, you're an institution here," he had said during our planning meeting 6 weeks ago. "We need to celebrate your legacy properly. You deserve recognition for everything you've built." At the time, his words had felt genuine, even touching. David was 42 years old, Harvard MBA, and had joined Morrison Associates 5 years earlier with impressive credentials and an aggressive vision for expansion. He was charming, articulate, and politically savvy in ways that had quickly elevated him through the corporate hierarchy. When the board had chosen him to succeed the retiring CEO, I had been genuinely supportive, believing that his fresh perspective would complement the institutional wisdom I could provide during the transition period. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, the subtle shifts in his behavior toward me that should have warned me about what was coming. But hindsight is always clearer than the moment, and in the moment, I was focused on ensuring a smooth transition and maintaining the relationships I had spent decades building. The morning passed normally enough. I attended the weekly strategy meeting, reviewed quarterly projections with my team, and handled the dozen small crises that always seemed to emerge on Fridays. My assistant, Jennifer, had been fielding calls all week from colleagues wanting to attend the retirement party, and she kept updating me on the growing guest list with obvious excitement about the evening's celebration. "Mrs. Chen, the caterers confirmed everything for tonight," she said around 11, stopping by my office with her usual efficient smile. "The boardroom setup looks beautiful, and we've got confirmations from 87 people, including some clients who specifically asked to be there to honor your contributions." Jennifer was 26 years old, brilliant, and reminded me of myself when I first started at Morrison Associates. I had been mentoring her for the past 2 years, helping her navigate the complexities of corporate culture while developing her analytical skills. She was one of the people I would miss most about leaving, and I had already written detailed recommendations to help ensure her continued advancement within the company. "That's wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you for organizing everything so perfectly. I know this wasn't in your job description, but you've handled it beautifully." I meant every word. The attention to detail and care she had put into planning the event reflected the same qualities that made her such a valuable team member. Around 2 o'clock, David stopped by my office, leaning against the doorframe with the casual confidence that had become his signature style. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, probably Italian, and his smile carried that particular charm that had served him well in client meetings and board presentations. "Rebecca, are you ready for tonight? I've been working on my speech all week. I want to make sure we properly acknowledge everything you've meant to this company." His tone was warm, almost affectionate, and I felt a flutter of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "I'm looking forward to it, David, though you know I would have been just as happy with something smaller. I've never been comfortable being the center of attention." This was true. Despite my senior position, I had always preferred to let my work speak for itself, rather than seeking the spotlight. "Nonsense. Tonight is about celebrating a remarkable career and the legacy you're leaving behind. Trust me, Rebecca, this is going to be a night you'll never forget." There was something in his expression as he said these words, a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify. At the time, I attributed it to the emotion of marking the end of our professional relationship. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had started at Morrison Associates in 1992, fresh out of the University of Washington with an MBA in strategic management and a head full of ambitious dreams. The consulting industry was much smaller then, more relationship-based, and success required building trust with clients through consistent delivery and genuine expertise rather than flashy presentations and aggressive sales tactics. My first boss, Harold Morrison, was the founder's son and a man who believed in developing talent through mentorship and gradual responsibility increases. He had taken a chance on me when other firms were reluctant to hire women for senior client-facing roles, and I had worked tirelessly to prove that his faith was justified. Harold had retired 8 years ago, but we still exchanged holiday cards and occasional phone calls about industry trends. Under Harold's guidance, I had learned the fundamentals of strategic consulting, how to analyze complex business problems, develop innovative solutions, and build lasting relationships with clients who trusted us with their most critical challenges. I had worked on projects ranging from small business restructurings to major corporate mergers, always focusing on understanding the human elements behind the numbers and spreadsheets. The 1990s and early 2000s had been a time of tremendous growth for Morrison Associates. We had expanded from 12 employees to over 200, opened offices in Portland and San Francisco, and built a client roster that included some of the most respected companies in the Pacific Northwest. I had been promoted steadily through the ranks, earning my stripes through successful project completions and the kind of client satisfaction that generates referrals and repeat business. By 2005, I was a partner, responsible for the Strategic Operations Division and managing a team of 30 consultants. I loved the intellectual challenges of the work, the variety of problems we solved, and the satisfaction of helping businesses navigate complex transitions and emerge stronger. More than that, I loved the culture we had built at Morrison Associates, a culture based on collaboration, mutual respect, and the understanding that our success depended on everyone contributing their best efforts. When David Harrison joined the company in 2019, I had been eager to work with him. His background was impressive: Harvard MBA, 5 years at McKinsey & Company, and a track record of helping technology companies scale rapidly. The consulting industry was evolving, becoming more data-driven and digitally focused, and I recognized that his skills could complement my experience in ways that would benefit both our clients and our company. Initially, our collaboration had been everything I hoped it would be. David brought fresh perspectives on digital transformation and analytics-driven decision-making, while I provided the institutional knowledge and client relationships that gave context to his innovations. We worked together on several major projects, including a digital transformation initiative for a regional bank that became a case study in industry publications. But somewhere along the way, our collaboration had shifted into something more competitive. David began questioning established processes, suggesting that my approaches were outdated, and proposing changes that seemed designed more to establish his authority than to improve our service delivery. I had attributed these tensions to the natural adjustment period that occurs when different management styles intersect, and I had tried to be supportive while also protecting the institutional knowledge and client relationships that I knew were valuable. When the board had announced David's promotion to CEO 18 months ago, I had been genuinely congratulatory. I believed that his vision for the company's future, combined with my experience and the strong team we had built, would position Morrison & Associates for continued growth and success. I had assumed that my role would evolve into something like Chief Operating Officer, providing operational expertise while supporting his strategic leadership. But David had other ideas about the company's future, and apparently, those ideas didn't include leveraging my experience or maintaining the collaborative culture I had helped build. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Over the past year, I had noticed subtle changes in how meetings were conducted, how decisions were made, and how my input was received. Projects I had traditionally led were reassigned to younger team members. Client relationships I had nurtured for decades were transferred to other partners. Strategic discussions that had once included my perspective were held without my participation. When David had suggested that I consider retirement during our annual review 6 months ago, I had been surprised but not entirely resistant to the idea. At 64, I had been thinking about slowing down, maybe traveling with my husband Richard, spending more time with our grandchildren, and pursuing some of the hobbies I had neglected during my career-focused years. The firm's generous retirement package made the financial transition comfortable, and David had assured me that my departure would be handled with the respect and recognition that my contributions deserved. "Rebecca, you've earned the right to enjoy your golden years," he had said during that conversation. And frankly, the company could benefit from bringing in some fresh blood, people who understand the current business environment and can help us adapt to changing client expectations. At the time, I had interpreted his comments as reasonable business considerations. The consulting industry was indeed evolving rapidly, with artificial intelligence, data analytics, and digital transformation creating new service categories and changing client expectations. Maybe it was time for someone with different skills and perspectives to lead the strategic operations division into the next phase of its development. As I sat in my office that Friday afternoon, preparing for the retirement party that would mark the end of my professional career, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what I had accomplished, sadness about leaving the work I loved, excitement about the opportunities that retirement might bring, and gratitude for the relationships I had built over 3 decades. I had no idea that within a few hours, all of those feelings would be overwhelmed by humiliation, anger, and a burning desire for justice that would change the trajectory of my future in ways I could never have imagined. At 5:30, I gathered my personal belongings from my office, including the framed photographs of my family, the awards I had received over the years, and the small potted orchid that had graced my windowsill for the past 5 years. Jennifer had arranged for everything else to be packed and shipped to my home, but these items felt too personal to trust to the moving company. The boardroom had been transformed for the evening's celebration. Round tables covered with white linens were arranged around the room, each decorated with elegant centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. A small stage had been set up at the front of the room, with a podium and microphone for the speeches that would mark the evening's program. The catering staff was putting finishing touches on the appetizer displays, and everything looked exactly as I had hoped it would. Colleagues began arriving around 6 o'clock, and I spent the first hour moving from table to table, reconnecting with people I had worked with over the years, and accepting their congratulations and well wishes. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory, filled with the kind of genuine affection that develops between people who have shared professional challenges and successes over many years. Margaret Foster, who had been my first hire when I became a partner, approached me with tears in her eyes and a warm embrace. "Rebecca, I can't believe you're really leaving. You've been such an incredible mentor to so many of us. The company won't be the same without you." Margaret was now a senior manager herself, having built her own successful career partly through the guidance and opportunities I had provided. Hearing her words and seeing the genuine emotion behind them reminded me of one of the most satisfying aspects of my career: the people I had helped develop and the relationships I had built through shared work and mutual respect. "Margaret, watching you grow into the leader you've become has been one of the greatest rewards of my career. You have all the skills and instincts to continue building on what we've created here. I know the future is in good hands with people like you carrying the work forward." Similar conversations occurred throughout the evening. Tom Richardson, a client whose company I had helped navigate a major restructuring 5 years earlier, had driven up from Portland specifically to attend the retirement party. "Rebecca, I wanted to be here tonight because your work literally saved our company. The strategic plan you developed got us through the worst crisis in our 60-year history, and we're stronger now than we've ever been." These interactions reminded me why I had fallen in love with consulting in the first place. Beyond the analytical challenges and problem-solving satisfaction, the work was fundamentally about helping people and organizations reach their potential. The relationships built through shared challenges created bonds that extended far beyond individual projects or business transactions. Around 7:30, David called for everyone's attention and invited me to join him at the podium for the formal portion of the evening's program. The room quieted as people took their seats, and I felt a familiar flutter of nervousness that always preceded public speaking, even after decades of client presentations and conference addresses. "Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "We're here tonight to celebrate the remarkable career of Rebecca Chen, who has been the backbone of Morrison Associates for 32 extraordinary years." The audience applauded warmly, and I felt a surge of gratitude for their recognition and support. This was exactly the kind of acknowledgement I had hoped for: respectful, appreciative, and focused on the contributions rather than the departure. David continued with what seemed like a heartfelt tribute to my career, highlighting major projects, client successes, and the growth the company had experienced during my tenure. He spoke about my mentorship of younger colleagues, my dedication to maintaining high service standards, and my role in building the collaborative culture that had become Morrison Associates' signature characteristic. "Rebecca has been more than just a colleague or even a partner," he said, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. "She has been the institutional memory of this company, the keeper of our values, and the person we could always count on to provide wisdom and perspective when difficult decisions needed to be made. The audience responded positively to his words, and I found myself relaxing into the moment, feeling genuinely appreciated and properly recognized for the work I had dedicated my life to. This was exactly how I had hoped my career would conclude, with dignity, respect, and acknowledgement of contributions that had made a real difference. But then, something in David's tone shifted. The warmth in his voice became more formal, more businesslike, and I sensed that he was transitioning into a different part of his speech. As we celebrate Rebecca's past contributions, it's also important to acknowledge that her retirement represents an opportunity for Morrison Associates to evolve and adapt to the changing business environment, he said, and I felt the first stirring of unease about where this was heading. The consulting industry today requires different skills, different approaches, and different perspectives than it did 30 years ago. Our clients expect us to understand artificial intelligence, data analytics, digital transformation, and emerging technologies that weren't even concepts when Rebecca started her career. The room was becoming quieter, and I could sense a shift in the audience's energy. What had started as a celebration was beginning to feel more like a business presentation, and not necessarily a positive one for me. While we certainly appreciate everything Rebecca has accomplished, we also have to be realistic about the fact that the business world has moved beyond many of the approaches and methodologies that defined her generation of consultants. I felt my stomach beginning to tighten as David's words took on an increasingly dismissive tone. This wasn't the respectful transition speech I had expected. This was something else entirely, and I was starting to understand that I had been set up for something much more humiliating than a simple retirement celebration. David's voice grew more confident, more authoritative, as he continued. The truth is, consulting today requires people who understand technology, who can speak the language of data analytics, who can help clients navigate digital transformation, challenges that require completely different skill sets than traditional strategic planning. The audience was now completely silent, and I could see confused and uncomfortable expressions on many faces. People had come expecting to honor my career, not to hear a lecture about why my skills were obsolete. And let's be honest, David said, his voice taking on a casual, almost conversational tone that somehow made his words even more devastating. The work Rebecca has been doing for the past few years, well, anyone could do it. Strategic operations, process improvement, organizational development. These aren't exactly cutting-edge specialties anymore. I felt the blood draining from my face as the full impact of his words hit me. This wasn't just a dismissive comment about changing industry requirements. This was a personal attack on my value, my relevance, and my contributions, delivered in front of 87 colleagues, clients, and friends who had come to honor my career. "Let's be honest, Rebecca," he said, turning to look directly at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been coasting for years. Anyone could do what you do. You're completely replaceable." The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystals shattering against the marble floor as the room erupted in shocked murmurs and uncomfortable shuffling. I stood frozen at the podium, unable to process what had just happened, unable to formulate any response to the most professionally humiliating moment of my life. David's smile widened as he looked out at the stunned audience. But that's exactly why tonight is so perfect for everyone. Rebecca gets to retire with dignity, and Morrison Associates gets to move forward with people who actually understand the modern business environment. I don't remember much about the next few minutes. I have vague memories of Margaret Foster standing up and walking out in obvious disgust, of Tom Richardson approaching the podium to check if I was all right, of Jennifer rushing to clean up the broken glass while shooting looks of fury at David. The room gradually emptied as people made awkward excuses about early morning commitments and family obligations, leaving behind half-eaten appetizers and the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration. By 8:30, Only David, myself, and a few of his closest allies remained in the boardroom. I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" I asked, looking directly at him. "Why would you do this? Why humiliate me in front of everyone we work with?" David's expression had returned to its usual charming mask, but there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that I had never noticed before. "Rebecca, I'm sorry if that came across as harsh, but sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions and communicating hard truths. The company needs to move forward, and that means being honest about where we've been and where we're going." "This was my retirement party," I said, my voice growing stronger as anger began to replace shock. "These were people who came to honor 32 years of dedicated service. You turned it into a performance designed to humiliate me." "I turned it into an opportunity to set expectations for the future," he replied smoothly. "And frankly, Rebecca, if you can't handle honest feedback about your performance, maybe that proves my point about why it's time for you to step aside." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand how I had so completely misjudged the character of someone I had worked with for 5 years. The man standing before me bore no resemblance to the colleague I thought I knew, the person I had supported and mentored and trusted with the legacy I had spent decades building. "You're right about one thing, David," I said finally, my voice steady now with a cold clarity I hadn't felt in years. "It is time for changes at Morrison Associates. You have no idea how right you are about that." I walked out of the boardroom with as much dignity as I could muster, leaving behind the broken glass, the abandoned celebration, and any illusions I might have had about David Harrison's character or intentions. But I also left with something else, a burning determination to prove that Rebecca Chen was far from replaceable, and that underestimating me would be the biggest mistake David Harrison had ever made in his career. The drive home to my house in Bellevue was a blur of anger, humiliation, and growing resolve. Richard was waiting up for me, having expected to hear about a wonderful evening celebrating my career achievements. Instead, he found his wife of 38 years standing in our kitchen, still wearing her cocktail dress and pearls, recounting the most professionally devastating experience of her life. "He said I was replaceable," I told him, the words still burning in my throat. "In front of everyone. In front of clients, colleagues, people who have worked with me for decades. He turned my retirement party into his opportunity to prove that everything I've built doesn't matter." Richard, who had supported my career through every challenge and success, who had understood the long hours and weekend work and business travel because he knew how much I loved what I did, looked at me with an expression of fury I had rarely seen in our decades together. "That's not just unprofessional, Rebecca. That's cruel. And it's stupid. He has no idea what he just unleashed." Richard was right about David not understanding what he had unleashed. Because what David Harrison didn't know, what he couldn't have known despite all his Harvard education and McKinsey experience, was that Rebecca Chen had spent the past 6 months not just planning her retirement, but also planning something much more significant: the launch of her own consulting firm, backed by substantial financial resources and built around the client relationships she had spent 3 decades developing. What David didn't know was that my obsolete strategic operations expertise was exactly what dozens of companies were desperately seeking as they tried to navigate post-pandemic business challenges that required experienced leadership rather than theoretical knowledge. What David didn't know was that Margaret Foster, Tom Richardson, and 8 other key Morrison Associates employees had already agreed to join my new firm, bringing with them client relationships worth millions of dollars in annual revenue. And what David definitely didn't know was that the board of directors had approached me 3 months earlier about the possibility of acquiring Morrison Associates when it inevitably struggled under his inexperienced leadership, and that I had been seriously considering their proposal. As I stood in my kitchen that night, still processing the humiliation of the evening, but also feeling the first stirrings of anticipation about what was coming next, I realized that David Harrison had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He had underestimated Rebecca Chen, dismissed her as irrelevant and replaceable, and in doing so had created the perfect motivation for me to prove him spectacularly wrong. The retirement party was over, but the real story was just beginning. And David Harrison was about to learn that when you humiliate someone with 32 years of experience, extensive industry relationships, and a detailed understanding of your company's vulnerabilities, you better be absolutely certain they don't have the resources and determination to fight back. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, I was content to savor the anticipation of what was about to unfold, and the knowledge that sometimes the most devastating defeats are actually setups for the most spectacular victories. The alarm clock read 4:47 a.m. when I gave up pretending to sleep and padded barefoot to my home office, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and the determination that had been building since I walked out of that boardroom. Richard was still sleeping, soundly, and the house was wrapped in the kind of pre-dawn silence that makes everything feel possible, even revenge. My home office had always been my sanctuary, a space where I could think clearly and work without the distractions of corporate politics and office interruptions. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing 30 years' worth of business, journals, case studies, and strategic planning resources. My desk faced the window overlooking our garden, where the early morning light was just beginning to filter through the maple trees Richard had planted when we first moved to this house. But this morning, I wasn't looking at the garden or reaching for my usual business publications. Instead, I was opening my laptop and accessing files I had been quietly organizing for months, files that David Harrison had no idea existed, and that would become the foundation for everything that was about to unfold. The truth was, David's humiliation at the retirement party had actually done me a favor. It had crystallized my thinking and eliminated any lingering doubts I might have had about the path I was already planning to take. For 6 months, I had been preparing for something much bigger than retirement, and now I had the perfect motivation to execute those plans with the kind of focused intensity that only comes from righteous anger. I opened the folder labeled Strategic Independence Initiative, a project I had been working on during evenings and weekends while maintaining my full responsibilities at Morrison Associates. The name was intentionally bland, designed to sound like just another corporate planning exercise if anyone happened to see it. But the contents represented something far more significant: a comprehensive business plan for launching Chen Strategic Solutions, my own consulting firm built around the relationships and expertise I had developed over 3 decades. The initial market analysis had taken me 2 months to complete, working with a discreet business development consultant who specialized in helping senior executives transition into entrepreneurship. We had identified 43 companies in the Pacific Northwest that were struggling with exactly the kind of strategic operations challenges that David Harrison considered obsolete. These were mid-sized businesses, typically family-owned or closely held corporations, that needed experienced guidance to navigate complex organizational changes, but couldn't afford the premium fees charged by the major consulting firms. What made these companies perfect clients for my new venture wasn't just their need for strategic expertise, but their preference for working with consultants who understood their values and could build genuine relationships rather than just delivering slick presentations and generic recommendations. These were the kinds of clients I had always enjoyed working with most, the ones who appreciated the human elements of business strategy and who valued experience over theoretical frameworks. The financial projections were even more encouraging than I had initially hoped. Conservative estimates suggested that Chen Strategic Solutions could generate $2 million in revenue during its first year, growing to $5 million by year 3. More importantly, the profit margins would be significantly higher than what I had been used to at Morrison Associates, since I wouldn't be supporting the overhead costs of a large corporate infrastructure. But the most exciting aspect of the business plan wasn't the financial potential. It was the opportunity to work with a carefully selected team of professionals who shared my values and approach to consulting. Over the past months, I had been having discreet conversations with colleagues who I knew were frustrated with the direction David Harrison was taking Morrison Associates. What I had discovered was that I wasn't the only one feeling marginalized and undervalued by his leadership style. Margaret Foster had been the first person I approached during a casual lunch meeting 6 weeks after David had been promoted to CEO. I had been careful not to explicitly criticize the company or suggest any specific alternatives, but I had asked her about her career goals and whether she felt she was getting the opportunities for growth and leadership that she deserved. "Rebecca, can I be completely honest with you?" Margaret had said, leaning forward with the kind of intensity that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask exactly this question. "I'm miserable. David has completely changed the culture of the place. Everything is about metrics and efficiency and proving our value through spreadsheets instead of results. I spend more time documenting my work than actually doing it, and I feel like all the client relationships I've built are being systematically undermined by his focus on short-term revenue maximization." Margaret's frustration had been exactly what I expected, but hearing it confirmed had given me the confidence to be more direct about my own plans. What if there was an alternative? What if you could work in an environment that valued the things you're best at, where you could focus on delivering exceptional client service without having to justify every decision through bureaucratic processes? The conversation that followed had lasted 3 hours and had resulted in Margaret becoming the first official recruit for Chen's Strategic Solutions. Her expertise in organizational development and change management would be crucial for the new firm, and her existing client relationships represented nearly $800,000 in potential annual revenue. Tom Richardson, the client, from Portland who had attended my retirement party, had been the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. During a follow-up phone call the week after David's humiliating performance, Tom had been remarkably direct about his dissatisfaction with Morrison Associates' recent service delivery. "Rebecca, I have to tell you, the quality of work we've been getting from your firm has declined significantly over the past year. The people David assigns to our projects don't seem to understand our business, and they keep pushing solutions that work for technology companies, but don't make sense for traditional manufacturing operations like ours." This feedback had been both disappointing and valuable. Disappointing because it confirmed that David's changes were already having negative impacts on client satisfaction. Valuable because it gave me specific examples of how my approach to consulting could provide better results than what Morrison Associates was currently delivering. "Tom, what if I told you that I was considering starting my own firm, one focused specifically on helping companies like yours navigate strategic challenges without having to adapt to generic solutions designed for different industries?" Tom's response had been immediate and enthusiastic. "Rebecca, if you start your own firm, you'll have our business on day one. We've been working with you for 8 years, and we trust your judgment more than anyone else in the consulting industry. David Harrison doesn't know our business, doesn't understand our challenges, and frankly, doesn't seem to care about developing that understanding." Within 2 weeks of that conversation, Tom had provided written confirmation that his company would commit to a 12-month consulting contract worth $400,000, contingent on my establishing an independent practice. He had also introduced me to 3 other manufacturing executives who were facing similar frustrations with their current consulting relationships. The domino effect had been remarkable. Each new contact led to additional referrals, and within 6 weeks, I had preliminary commitments for over $2 million in first-year revenue. More importantly, I had identified 12 experienced consultants who were interested in joining the new firm, including several senior-level professionals from other companies who were looking for opportunities to work in a more collaborative and client-focused environment. Kevin Zhao, a former colleague from Morrison Associates who had left 3 years earlier to join a larger firm, had been particularly valuable in helping me understand the competitive landscape and identify the market positioning that would give Chen Strategic Solutions the best chance for success. Rebecca, the industry is ready for exactly what you're proposing, he had told me during a confidential meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Bellevue. The big firms are becoming more impersonal and process-driven every year, while the small, boutique firms often lack the experience and credibility to handle complex strategic challenges. You're positioned perfectly to capture the middle market, companies that need sophisticated expertise but want to work with people who actually understand their business. Kevin had also provided crucial intelligence about Morrison Associates, financial situation, information that would prove invaluable in the months ahead. According to his contacts within the industry, David Harrison's aggressive expansion plans were straining the company's cash flow, and several major clients were expressing dissatisfaction with the new service delivery model. David is trying to scale the business too quickly, Kevin had explained. He's hiring consultants with impressive resumes but no real experience, and he's bidding on projects that are outside the firm's core competencies. The partners are starting to get nervous about the financial projections, and there are rumors that some of the founding investors are considering their options. This intelligence had been the catalyst for the most ambitious component of my strategic plan. If Morrison and Associates was indeed heading for financial difficulties under David's leadership, there might be an opportunity not just to compete with them, but to acquire them entirely. The irony would be exquisite. The woman David had dismissed as Replaceable could potentially become his new boss within 18 months. But executing that kind of acquisition would require significant financial resources, more than I could generate through the consulting revenue alone. Which was why I had spent considerable time over the past months exploring partnership opportunities with private equity firms and investment groups that specialized in professional services acquisitions. The breakthrough had come through an introduction from Harold Morrison, my former mentor who still maintained extensive contacts throughout the business community. Harold had connected me with Patricia Walsh, a managing partner at Northwest Capital Partners, an investment firm that had been looking for opportunities to expand their portfolio in the consulting industry. My initial meeting with Patricia had been scheduled for 1 hour, but had lasted nearly 4, as we explored the potential for Chen Strategic Solutions to serve as a platform for acquiring and consolidating smaller consulting firms throughout the Pacific Northwest. Patricia's vision was remarkably aligned with my own: build a regional consulting powerhouse that could compete with the national firms while maintaining the personalized service and deep local knowledge that clients valued. Rebecca, your track record and industry relationships give us exactly the foundation we need for this kind of expansion strategy, Patricia had explained during our second meeting. We're prepared to provide up to $10 million in initial capital with additional funding available for strategic acquisitions. The question is whether you're interested in thinking bigger than just launching your own practice. The partnership structure Patricia proposed was more generous than I had dared to hope. I would maintain majority ownership of Chen Strategic Solutions while Northwest Capital Partners provided the financial backing for rapid expansion. More importantly, the partnership would give me access to the resources needed to pursue larger acquisition opportunities, including potentially acquiring Morrison and Associates if the right circumstances developed. But the most satisfying aspect of these preparations wasn't the financial potential or even the prospect of acquiring my former company. It was the opportunity to prove that the expertise David Harrison had dismissed as obsolete was actually exactly what the market needed. Every conversation I had with potential clients reinforced the same theme. Businesses were tired of consultants who delivered generic solutions based on theoretical frameworks. They wanted advisors who understood their specific challenges and could provide practical guidance based on real experience. Sarah Kim, the CEO of a regional healthcare organization, had been particularly articulate about this frustration during our exploratory meeting. We've worked with 3 different consulting firms over the past 2 years, and they all seem to think that healthcare organizations are just like technology companies with different vocabulary. They don't understand our regulatory environment, our stakeholder complexity, or the long-term relationship building that's essential for success in this industry. Sarah's healthcare organization represented exactly the kind of client that Chen Strategic Solutions was designed to serve. They needed strategic guidance for a major organizational restructuring, but they also needed consultants who could navigate the political and cultural sensitivities that made healthcare different from other industries. The preliminary proposal I developed for their project demonstrated how my approach could deliver better results at lower costs than what they had been receiving from the larger firms. "Rebecca, this is exactly what we've been looking for," Sarah had said after reviewing my recommendations. "You've identified issues and opportunities that the other consultants completely missed, and your proposed timeline is realistic rather than artificially compressed to maximize billing hours." Similar feedback came from every potential client I met with. The market validation was overwhelming, and it reinforced my confidence that David Harrison's assessment of my irrelevance was not just personally insulting, but professionally wrong. The consulting industry hadn't moved beyond the need for experienced practitioners who could combine analytical skills with practical wisdom. If anything, the increasing complexity of the business environment made that combination more valuable than ever. By the time of my retirement party, all the pieces were in place for the launch of Chen Strategic Solutions. The business plan was complete, the initial funding was secured, the key personnel were recruited, and the client commitments were documented. I had been planning to announce the new venture during my final week at Morrison Associates, positioning it as a natural next chapter rather than a competitive challenge to my former employer. But David's performance at the retirement party had changed everything. What was supposed to be a respectful transition had become a declaration of war, and I was fully prepared to respond accordingly. The woman he had dismissed as replaceable was about to demonstrate just how valuable her relationships, expertise, and strategic thinking really were. The morning after the retirement party, I began making phone calls to execute the accelerated timeline that David's behavior had necessitated. The first call was to Patricia Walsh, who had been expecting to hear about a measured launch schedule spread over several months. "Patricia, I need to move up our timeline significantly. Something happened last night that changes the competitive dynamics, and I think we need to launch Chen Strategic Solutions within 30 days, rather than waiting until the end of the year." Patricia's response was immediate and supportive. "Rebecca, we've been ready to move forward whenever you give us the signal. What do you need from us to accelerate the launch?" The conversation that followed was precisely the kind of strategic discussion I had been missing at Morrison Associates under David's leadership. We talked through the implications of an accelerated timeline, identified the resources that would need to be mobilized quickly, and developed a communication strategy that would maximize the impact of our announcement while minimizing the time competitors would have to respond. The second call was to Margaret Foster, who answered her phone with the kind of wariness that suggested she was expecting difficult conversations following the previous evening's debacle. "Rebecca, I want you to know that what David did last night was completely unacceptable. Several of us are planning to speak with the board of directors about his behavior." Margaret's anger was gratifying, but I had more important things to discuss than David's poor judgment. "Margaret, I appreciate your support, but I have something more significant to talk about. Are you still interested in that alternative we discussed? Because I'm ready to make it official." The conversation that followed was one of the most satisfying of my professional career. Margaret's enthusiasm for joining Chen Strategic Solutions was immediate and complete, and she was ready to submit her resignation to Morrison Associates by the end of the week. More importantly, she confirmed that 3 other senior consultants were equally ready to make the transition, bringing our initial team to the critical mass needed for immediate operation. By noon, I had confirmed commitments from 8 consultants, including 2 senior managers and 3 specialists in areas that would be crucial for our service offerings. The team was exactly what I had hoped for: experienced professionals who shared my values and approach to consulting, but who brought diverse skills and perspectives that would enhance our collective capabilities. The third phase of my morning involved reaching out to the clients who had made preliminary commitments to work with Chen Strategic Solutions. These conversations were particularly important because I wanted to ensure that our accelerated timeline wouldn't compromise the quality of service they were expecting. Tom Richardson was characteristically direct in his response. "Rebecca, honestly, the sooner you can get started, the better. We have some strategic challenges that need immediate attention, and after what I witnessed last night, I have zero confidence in Morrison Associates' ability to provide the kind of guidance we need." Tom's reaction was typical of the feedback I received from every client contact. David's behavior at the retirement party had been witnessed by several current and potential clients, and their reactions ranged from disappointment to disgust. What was supposed to be a celebration of my career had instead become an inadvertent marketing event for my new venture. By the end of that first day, the foundation for Chen Strategic Solutions was not just planned, but actively under construction. The legal paperwork was in process, the office space was identified and under negotiation, and the initial client projects were being scoped and scheduled. More importantly, the team was energized and committed to proving that David Harrison's dismissive assessment of our capabilities was not just wrong, but spectacularly misjudged. But the most significant development came during my final conversation of the day, a call from Harold Morrison that I had been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect so quickly. "Rebecca, I heard about what happened at your retirement party. David. Harrison's behavior was inexcusable, and I want you to know that there are people within the Morrison Associates investor group who are having serious conversations about his leadership." Harold's words were carefully chosen, but the implications were clear. David's public humiliation of me had not gone unnoticed by the people who ultimately controlled the company's future, and his actions were being viewed as symptomatic of larger concerns about his judgment and leadership capabilities. "Harold, I appreciate you letting me know. I'm focused on moving forward with my own plans, but I want you to understand that I harbor no ill will toward Morrison Associates as an institution. My problems are with David's leadership, not with the company we all helped build." Harold's response suggested that he understood exactly what I was communicating. "Rebecca, the company's best interests and David's personal interests may not be aligned much longer. I think there are going to be opportunities for people who care about Morrison Associates' legacy to help shape its future direction." That evening, as I sat in my kitchen with Richard, reviewing the events of an extraordinary day, I realized that David Harrison had accomplished something I hadn't thought possible. In a single evening, he had transformed my retirement from a pleasant transition into the launching pad for the most ambitious and potentially satisfying phase of my professional career. "You know what the most ironic part of this is?" I told Richard as we shared a bottle of wine and processed the day's developments. "David thought he was diminishing my value and relevance. Instead, he's created the perfect conditions for me to demonstrate just how valuable my relationships and expertise really are." Richard, who had watched me navigate corporate politics for 3 decades, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had always understood that underestimating his wife was a mistake people made exactly once. "Rebecca, I think David Harrison is about to learn that there's a big difference between being replaceable and being irreplaceable. And I suspect he's going to learn that lesson in the most public and painful way possible." As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a level of excitement and anticipation that I hadn't experienced in years. The humiliation of the retirement party was already fading, replaced by the energizing prospect of building something significant and proving my worth in the most definitive way possible. David Harrison had wanted to demonstrate my irrelevance. Instead, he was about to discover just how relevant Rebecca Chen could be when she was properly motivated. The next morning brought news that confirmed just how quickly the dynamics were shifting. Jennifer, my former assistant, called before 7 a.m. with information that I knew she was risking her job to share. "Mrs. Chen, I thought you should know that 3 more senior consultants submitted their resignations yesterday afternoon. Mr. Harrison is in full panic mode, and there are emergency meetings scheduled all week to try to figure out how to manage the client relationships that are being affected. Jennifer's intelligence was valuable, but her willingness to share it was even more significant. It suggested that David's behavior at the retirement party had damaged his credibility not just with external stakeholders, but with the junior staff who would be crucial for maintaining operational continuity. Jennifer, I want you to know that if you're ever interested in exploring opportunities with a different kind of consulting firm, one that values people development and genuine teamwork, I hope you'll reach out to me. The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity as Chen Strategic Solutions moved from concept to reality with unprecedented speed. The office space was secured, a beautiful suite on the 20th floor of a building in downtown Bellevue, with views of both Lake Washington and the Seattle skyline. The legal structure was finalized, creating a partnership arrangement that gave me operational control while providing Northwest Capital Partners with the investment returns they required. Most importantly, the team was coming together with the kind of chemistry and shared purpose that I had been missing at Morrison Associates. Our first all-hands meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and the agenda reflected the ambitious scope of what we were planning to accomplish. But the most satisfying development came at the end of that first week, when Margaret Foster called with news that would accelerate our timeline even further. Rebecca, you're not going to believe this. David just lost the Pinnacle Industries account. They fired Morrison Associates yesterday, citing concerns about service quality and leadership stability. The contract was worth $800,000 annually. Pinnacle Industries had been one of Morrison Associates' flagship clients, a regional manufacturing company that I had personally brought into the firm 6 years earlier. Losing their business was not just a financial blow, but a credibility disaster that would send shockwaves through the industry. Margaret, do you think they might be interested in hearing about alternative consulting options? Margaret's laughter carried a note of anticipation that told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca, I think Pinnacle Industries would be very interested in working with consultants who understand their business and can provide the kind of stable, experienced guidance they've been missing. By the end of the second week, Chen Strategic Solutions had not only matched the client base I had projected for our first 6 months of operation, but exceeded it. The pipeline of potential projects was growing daily, fueled by word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied former clients and by the visible instability at Morrison Associates under David's leadership. The momentum was building towards something much bigger than a successful consulting practice. It was becoming clear that we had the opportunity to fundamentally reshape the competitive landscape in our market, and that David Harrison's dismissive assessment of my capabilities had set in motion a series of events that would ultimately prove to be his downfall. But the most significant revelation was still to come, and it would arrive in the form of a phone call that would transform everything I thought I knew about David Harrison's motivations and methods. That call would reveal that his behavior at the retirement party wasn't just poor judgment or professional jealousy, but part of a larger pattern of deception that had been systematically undermining Morrison Associates for months. The truth about David Harrison was far more disturbing than simple arrogance or inexperience. And when that truth finally emerged, it would provide the final piece of evidence needed to complete the most satisfying reversal of fortune I could have ever imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after Chen Strategic Solutions had officially opened its doors, and 3 months after David Harrison had declared me replaceable at my retirement party. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my new corner office, watching the morning ferry cross Elliott Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of downtown Seattle, when my phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. Rebecca, this is Amanda Pierce from the Seattle Business Journal. I'm calling because we've received some documents that suggest there may be irregularities in how Morrison Associates has been handling their client accounts and billing practices. Given your history with the company, I was hoping you might be willing to provide some context. Amanda Pierce was one of the most respected investigative business reporters in the Pacific Northwest, known for her thorough research and her ability to uncover financial misconduct that other journalists missed. If she was calling about Morrison Associates, it meant that someone had provided her with credible evidence of serious problems. Amanda, I'm not sure how much help I can be. I've been focused entirely on building my own practice since leaving. Morrison Associates. What kind of irregularities are you investigating? Amanda's response confirmed my growing suspicion that David Harrison's problems extended far beyond poor leadership and client relations. We have documentation suggesting that several major clients were billed for services that weren't actually provided, and that consulting hours were systematically inflated across multiple projects. We also have evidence of expense reimbursements that appear to be personal rather than business-related. The implications of Amanda's words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November weather. If Morrison Associates was indeed engaging in fraudulent billing practices, it would explain how David had been able to maintain the company's financial performance despite losing major clients and experienced staff. It would also mean that the firm I had spent 32 years building was being systematically destroyed by criminal behavior. Amanda, I can't comment on specific allegations since I don't have access to current financial records. But I can tell you that billing integrity was always one of our core principles when I was with the company. Any deviation from those standards would be completely contrary to the culture and values that Morrison Associates was built on. After ending the call with Amanda, I sat in my office staring out at the Seattle skyline and processing the implications of what I had just learned. If the Seattle Business Journal was investigating financial irregularities at Morrison Associates, it meant that David's problems were about to become very public and very serious. It also meant that the acquisition opportunity Patricia Walsh and I had been discussing might be accelerating toward reality faster than either of us had anticipated. My phone rang again within minutes, and this time the caller ID showed Harold Morrison's number. Harold rarely called during business hours unless something significant was happening, and his voice carried an urgency that confirmed my suspicions about the gravity of the situation. Rebecca, I need to see you as soon as possible. There are developments regarding Morrison Associates that you need to be aware of, and I think there may be opportunities that align with what you've been building at Chen Strategic Solutions. We arranged to meet that afternoon at Harold's private club in downtown Seattle, a discreet location where we could discuss sensitive matters without concern about being overheard by industry colleagues or competitors. The club's library was nearly empty at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, providing exactly the privacy that Harold's tone had suggested we would need. Harold looked older than I remembered, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the weariness of someone who had been dealing with difficult situations for longer than he cared to admit. He waited until we were seated in leather chairs beside a window overlooking Pioneer Square before beginning what would prove to be the most shocking conversation of my professional life. Rebecca, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until the appropriate legal processes have been completed. The board of directors has been conducting a comprehensive audit of Morrison Associates' financial practices under David Harrison's leadership, and what we've discovered is far worse than anyone imagined. Harold paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing with revelations that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my former colleague's character and methods. David has been systematically embezzling funds from client accounts, falsifying billing records, and using company resources for personal expenses. The total amount appears to be somewhere between $800,000 and $2 million, spread across 18 months of fraudulent activities. The numbers Harold cited were staggering, but even more shocking was the realization that David's criminal behavior had been occurring during the entire period when he was positioning himself as the future leader of the company. His criticism of my supposedly outdated methods had been a deliberate distraction from his own misconduct, and his aggressive expansion plans had been designed to mask the financial irregularities he was creating. Harold, how long has the board known about this? And why wasn't action taken sooner to protect the company and its clients? Harold's expression reflected the frustration and anger of someone who had watched an institution he cared about being systematically destroyed by someone he had trusted. We began noticing discrepancies about 6 weeks ago. Initially, small things that could have been attributed to accounting errors or administrative confusion. But when we started investigating more thoroughly, the pattern became undeniable. The timeline Harold described meant that the board's investigation had been ongoing during the period when David was publicly humiliating me at the retirement party and dismissing my contributions as irrelevant. He had been stealing from clients and undermining the company's financial integrity while simultaneously arguing that the firm needed to move beyond the ethical standards and relationship-based approach that I represented. The most disturbing aspect of this situation, Harold continued, is that David seems to have deliberately targeted your clients and projects for the most egregious billing fraud. We think he was trying to discredit your work while simultaneously using your reputation with those clients to justify inflated charges they wouldn't have questioned. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had David been stealing from the company, but he had been using my relationships and credibility as cover for his criminal activities. Clients who trusted me had been systematically defrauded, under the pretense of receiving the kind of high-quality service they associated with my name and reputation. Harold, which clients are we talking about? How extensive was the fraud involving my former accounts? The list Harold provided included some of the most important relationships I had built during my career at Morrison Associates. Pinnacle Industries, the manufacturing company that had recently terminated their contract, had been overcharged by nearly $60,000 for consulting services that were never actually provided. Pacific Northwest Healthcare, a long-term client that had worked exclusively with my team for 8 years, had been billed for 42 hours of senior partner time that was actually administrative work performed by junior staff. Each revelation was more infuriating than the last, not just because of the financial impact on the clients, but because of how David had weaponized my reputation to facilitate his theft. These were companies that had trusted Morrison Associates specifically because of their relationship with me, and David had exploited that trust for personal gain, while simultaneously working to push me out of the company. Rebecca, there's more you need to know about David's motivations and methods. The investigation has revealed that he's been planning to force you into retirement since shortly after he became CEO. We found emails and documents that show he viewed you as an obstacle to his plans for restructuring the company around a more aggressive, less relationship-focused business model. The documentation Harold described painted a picture of calculated manipulation that extended far beyond simple greed or opportunism. David had systematically worked to undermine my credibility within the company, while simultaneously using my client relationships to facilitate his fraudulent billing schemes. The retirement party humiliation hadn't been an impulsive moment of poor judgment, but the culmination of an 18-month campaign to eliminate me as a potential threat to his plans. But here's what David didn't anticipate, Harold said, and for the first time since our conversation began, his expression showed a hint of satisfaction. His criminal behavior has created exactly the kind of crisis that makes an acquisition by your new firm not just possible, but necessary to preserve Morrison Associates' reputation and client relationships. Harold's words confirmed what I had been hoping but hadn't dared to assume. The financial scandal would force Morrison Associates into a position where they would need to find a buyer quickly, and Chen Strategic Solutions was uniquely positioned to provide both the financial resources and the credibility necessary to stabilize the situation. The board has already had preliminary discussions with Patricia Walsh at Northwest Capital Partners, Harold continued. There's strong interest in structuring a transaction that would allow Chen Strategic Solutions to acquire Morrison Associates' client contracts and intellectual property while leaving David's criminal liabilities with the existing corporate entity. The acquisition structure Harold described was more favorable than anything Patricia and I had discussed during our initial planning conversations. Instead of competing with Morrison Associates for market share, we would be inheriting their entire client base while simultaneously distancing ourselves from the legal and financial problems created by David's misconduct. Harold, what's the timeline for this transaction? And what happens to David? Harold's expression grew grim as he addressed the question I had been afraid to ask directly. David will be terminated immediately once the board's investigation is complete, probably within the next 2 weeks. Criminal charges will follow, and he'll likely face significant prison time given the scope of the fraud. As for the acquisition, we're hoping to complete the transaction within 60 days to minimize disruption to client relationships. The speed of the proposed timeline reflected the severity of Morrison Associates' situation, but it also created opportunities that I hadn't expected to have so soon. Instead of building Chen Strategic Solutions gradually over several years, we would be absorbing an established client base and experienced staff within months of our launch. But the most satisfying aspect of Harold's revelations wasn't the business opportunity they represented. It was the complete vindication of everything I had tried to tell David about the importance of ethical practices, client relationships, and long-term thinking. His dismissal of my supposedly outdated methods had been cover for criminal behavior that was ultimately destroying everything I had helped build. The meeting with Harold concluded with agreements about confidentiality and preliminary terms for the acquisition discussions. As I drove back to my office in Bellevue, I found myself processing emotions that ranged from fury at David's betrayal to excitement about the unprecedented opportunity his downfall was creating. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my senior partners at Chen Strategic Solutions to brief them on the developing situation. Margaret Foster, Kevin Zhao, and the other key members of our team gathered in our conference room to hear what would prove to be the most significant strategic development in our young company's history. What I'm about to tell you is confidential. Until the legal processes are completed, I began, echoing Harold's warning from earlier in the day. But Morrison Associates is facing a financial scandal that will likely result in our opportunity to acquire their client base and operations within the next 2 months. The reaction from my partners was exactly what I had hoped for: immediate. Understanding of the opportunity combined with determination to execute flawlessly. These were professionals who had been frustrated by David's leadership and who understood better than anyone how his methods had been damaging client relationships and undermining service quality. "Rebecca, this is incredible," Margaret said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who saw the chance to prove that our approach to consulting was not just viable but superior. "We'll be able to demonstrate that ethical practices and relationship-focused service delivery aren't outdated concepts, but competitive advantages that clients value more than ever." The strategic planning session that followed lasted until nearly midnight as we worked through the operational challenges of integrating Morrison Associates' client base with our existing projects and staff. The complexity was significant, but the opportunity was even more substantial. Within months of being dismissed as replaceable, I would potentially be leading a consulting firm with over 40 employees and annual revenue approaching $8 million. But the most satisfying moment came the following morning, when Amanda Pierce from the Seattle Business Journal called to inform me that their investigation into Morrison Associates would be published the next day, and that David Harrison had been arrested on charges of embezzlement and wire fraud. "Rebecca, I wanted to give you advance notice about the story since you're mentioned as someone whose client relationships were exploited for fraudulent billing. We'd also like to include a comment about how this situation affects the consulting industry more broadly." The statement I provided to Amanda was carefully crafted to express appropriate concern about the impact on clients while positioning Chen Strategic Solutions as a credible alternative for companies seeking ethical consulting services. This situation is deeply troubling because it violates the fundamental trust that clients place in their consulting partners. At Chen Strategic Solutions, We've built our practice around the principle that ethical behavior and transparent communication are the foundation of effective consulting relationships. We're committed to helping any organizations that may have been affected by these irregularities. The Seattle Business Journal article appeared the next morning with a front-page headline that captured the magnitude of David's downfall. Morrison Associates CEO arrested on embezzlement charges. Consulting firm faces financial crisis. The story detailed the scope of David's criminal behavior, the impact on affected clients, and the board's efforts to find a buyer who could preserve the company's operations. But the most significant development came later that day, when Tom Richardson called to inform me that Pinnacle Industries wanted to meet immediately about transferring their consulting needs to Chen Strategic Solutions. Rebecca, we've been following the news about Morrison Associates, and frankly, we're relieved that our suspicions about declining service quality were justified. We want to discuss moving our entire strategic planning contract to your firm, and we'd like to do it as quickly as possible. Tom's call was followed by similar inquiries from 6 other former Morrison Associates clients, each expressing urgency about finding a new consulting partner who could provide the kind of reliable, ethical service they had been missing. By the end of the week, Chen Strategic Solutions had received requests for proposals totaling over $3 million in annual revenue. The momentum was building toward the kind of complete reversal that I couldn't have imagined when David was humiliating me at the retirement party 3 months earlier. But the most satisfying moment was still to come, and it would occur during a phone call that would complete the circle of justice in the most poetic way possible. Patricia Walsh called the following Monday to confirm that Northwest Capital Partners had reached agreement with the Morrison Associates board on acquisition terms that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Chen Strategic Solutions would acquire the company's client contracts, intellectual property, and key personnel for a purchase price that represented a fraction of their pre-scandal value. Rebecca, this transaction will make Chen Strategic Solutions the dominant mid-market consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest virtually overnight. You'll have the client base, the staff, and the reputation to compete with firms that took decades to build their market position. But the most remarkable aspect of the acquisition wasn't the business expansion it represented. It was the opportunity to implement the kind of ethical, relationship-focused consulting practices that David had dismissed as obsolete. Every client conversation, every project proposal, and every staff interaction would demonstrate that the values he had rejected were actually the competitive advantages that clients valued most. The closing occurred on a Friday morning in January, exactly 4 months after my retirement party and 3 months after David's arrest. I signed the documents that made me the majority owner of the company where I had spent 32 years. The company that David Harrison had been systematically destroying through criminal behavior and poor judgment. But the most satisfying moment of the entire experience came later that afternoon, when I was reviewing personnel files and discovered that David had submitted a job application to Chen Strategic Solutions from the county jail where he was being held pending trial. The application was brief and desperate, claiming that his legal troubles were the result of misunderstandings and accounting errors rather than deliberate fraud. He requested an opportunity to discuss how his experience and industry knowledge could contribute to our firm's continued growth. I stared at the application for several minutes, remembering his words from the retirement party about how anyone could do what I did and how I was completely replaceable. The irony was so perfect that it almost seemed fictional. The man who had declared me obsolete was now begging for a job at the company I had built to compete with him. My response was brief and professional, exactly the kind of communication that David should have received when he was dismissing my contributions as worthless. Dear Mr. Harrison, thank you for your interest in Chen Strategic Solutions. After careful consideration, we have determined that your background and qualifications do not align with our organizational values and client service standards. We wish you success in finding opportunities that are better suited to your particular skills and experience. The letter was signed with my title as Chief Executive Officer of Chen Strategic Solutions, the position that David's criminal behavior and poor judgment had made possible. 6 months later, I was standing in the same boardroom where David had humiliated me at my retirement party. But this time, I was addressing the assembled staff of what was now the largest independent consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest. The room was filled with over 60 employees, including many who had joined us from other companies seeking the kind of collaborative, ethical work environment that had become our signature characteristic. When I left Morrison Associates 8 months ago, I was told that I was replaceable, that my approach to consulting was outdated, and that the industry had moved beyond the need for experienced practitioners who valued relationships over transactions. I said, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity, talent, and commitment that had made our rapid growth possible. I want each of you to know that building this company has been the most rewarding professional experience of my career, not because of the financial success we've achieved, but because we've proven that ethical practices, collaborative teamwork, and genuine client service are not outdated concepts, but competitive advantages that create sustainable value. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, reflecting the satisfaction of people who knew they were part of something meaningful and successful. But the most satisfying moment came after the meeting, when Margaret Foster approached me with news that completed the story of David Harrison's downfall. "Rebecca, I thought you should know that David was sentenced yesterday. 8 years in federal prison, full restitution to the clients he defrauded, and a lifetime ban from working in the financial services or consulting industries. The sentence was appropriate for the scope of David's crimes, but more importantly, it provided closure for the clients and employees who had been victimized by his behavior. Justice had been served not just through the legal system, but through the marketplace, where ethical practices and genuine expertise had prevailed over manipulation and fraud." As I stood in my office that evening, looking out at the Seattle skyline and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment, I realized that David Harrison had been right about one thing. Changes were indeed necessary at Morrison Associates. But the changes that were needed weren't the elimination of experienced practitioners or the abandonment of relationship-focused service delivery. The changes that were needed were exactly what Chen Strategic Solutions had implemented: a recommitment to ethical practices, genuine collaboration, and the understanding that consulting is fundamentally about helping people and organizations reach their potential. David had been wrong about almost everything else, but he had been correct that transformation was necessary. The woman he had dismissed as replaceable had indeed been replaced, but not in the way he had intended. Rebecca Chen, the loyal employee, had been replaced by Rebecca Chen, the entrepreneur, the industry leader, and the living proof that experience, integrity, and genuine expertise are never truly obsolete. The retirement party had ended with broken glass and shattered dignity. But the real story had concluded with justice served, principles vindicated, and the most satisfying reversal of fortune I could have ever imagined. David Harrison had called me replaceable, never knowing that I would become his replacement in the most complete and poetic way possible. 3 years later, Chen Strategic Solutions had grown to over 120 employees with offices in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. We had been recognized as the fastest-growing consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest and had received multiple awards for workplace culture and client satisfaction. But the achievement I was most proud of was simpler and more personal. We had built a company where people were valued for their contributions, where ethical practices were non-negotiable, and where success was measured not just by financial performance, but by the positive impact we had on our clients and our community. David Harrison, meanwhile, was serving his sentence at a federal minimum security facility, where I hoped he was learning that character and integrity are not outdated concepts, but timeless requirements for meaningful success. I never visited him, never wrote to him, and never spoke about him publicly, except to acknowledge the lessons his downfall had taught about the importance of ethical leadership. But I did think about him occasionally, usually when I was reviewing our quarterly results or celebrating another major client success. I thought about how he had mistaken kindness for weakness, experience for obsolescence, and respect for irrelevance. Most of all, I thought about how he had provided the perfect motivation for me to prove that Rebecca Chen was anything but replaceable. The retirement party had lasted 3 hours. The revenge had taken 3 years to complete fully. But the satisfaction of proving David Harrison wrong would last for the rest of my life, along with the knowledge that sometimes the most devastating defeats are actually setups for the most spectacular victories. Standing in my corner office on the 40th floor of the Columbia Center, with a view that encompassed Elliott Bay, Mount Rainier, and the city where I had built my career and my company, I raised a glass of champagne in a private toast to the ideal woman who had been humiliated at her retirement party and had responded by building something better than anything her critics had ever imagined possible. David Harrison had been wrong about my being replaceable, but he had been absolutely right about one thing. It was indeed time for changes at Morrison Associates. The changes just hadn't been the ones he was expecting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.